Minutes past 8 is the time. It's Tuesday's Cross Question on LBC. I'm Iain Dale, and we are looking forward to a lot of questions. Full switchboard at the moment, but do keep trying if you can't get through. And you can, of course, send your question in by text on 84850, or say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. Who will you be getting answers from? Let me introduce my panel to you. Nikki Aiken is Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party and MP for the cities of London and Westminster. Charlotte Nichols is Labour MP for Warrington North. Zach Polanski is Deputy Leader of the Green Party of England and Wales and a member of the London Assembly. And Henry Hill is Deputy Editor of Conservative Home, which is, I should say, independent of the Conservative Party leadership, commonly known as a thorn in its side from time to time. Right, we will get cracking with our first question in just a moment.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
And our first question comes from Martin in Doncaster. Hello, Martin.
Hello, Iain and panel. Yeah, my question is after losing to Liz Truss and 1,000 council seat losses, is Rishi Sunak a vote winner?
Henry Hill, I'm going to come to you first. Yeah, I'm sure you thought I was going to go to Nikki, but we'll save her torture for later. What are your readers telling you? Because I think that is a really interesting question, the way that Martin's put it.
I mean, so grading on a curve coming after Liz Truss, right? So is Rishi Sunak a vote winner compared to the 50 days? Yeah. That's great. That's a bar he's cleared. He's sort of steadied the ship. But there is a big question for the Conservative Party after having been in office for 13 years about whether or not they can come up with a positive reason, a narrative, if you like, a vision that can persuade people to vote for them, because there are lots of different elements of the Conservative Party's grassroots which are feeling pretty let down that after a span in government as long as New Labour's, there's so little that they want in terms of Conservative policy has been achieved. And then amongst the public at large, you had the huge promise in 2019 of a different sort of conservatism, a sort of higher spending conservatism, and then it has not delivered on that promise, at least not yet. So currently Rishi Sunak's focusing on some really technocratic stuff which he can deliver, but that's not going to be enough. He needs to come up with a reason to get people excited, if possible, about voting Conservative in 2024.
And some MPs are talking about he's got to lay out a grand vision for the country. He's laid out sort of 5 pledges so far, all of which are a bit sort of mushy. What do you think he needs to do?
Well, he does need to give people an idea of what the Conservative Party, instead of just fixing on, immediate problems, which are important, he needs to tell people what he'd like the party to look like in 5 or 10 years' time. Conservative Home did an interview with the Prime Minister in which we asked him, why are you in politics? What's your vision? And he kept pivoting back to, I have my 5 pledges. And it's like, well, are you nothing without an in tray? What brought you into politics in the first place? And I couldn't tell you at the moment, if you handed Rishi Sunak a magic wand and you said, right, wave this and we will get your vision of Britain in 10 years' time, I'm not entirely sure that I can tell you what that would be. And I cover the Conservative Party for a living, so I don't see how the public is supposed to know.
Charlotte Nichols, I'm sure we'll come on to Labour in a bit, but let's stick to Martin's question for the moment. After losing against Liz Truss and also losing 1,000 council seats, is Rishi Sunak a vote winner? You got the ball on the penalty spot. You can't really miss the goal, can you?
Rishi Sunak lost to Liz Truss, who in turn lost to a lettuce. And I don't think that there's anyone that can spin the results that the Conservatives had last week as anything other than an abject failure. I think people are sick of 13 years of Conservative government. I think you can point to almost any public service and ask people, does this work better than it did 13 years ago? And the answer you'll get is no. And I think that people are looking for a change.
OK, you set me a challenge. Let me see if I can. Nikki should be doing this, but we'll come to her in a moment. I had an email from somebody who subscribes to my newsletter today from the North East saying nobody's noticed that in the North East the Conservatives now have more councillors than they had 4 years ago, and they've got more votes than they got 4 years ago, and I think got more votes than Labour. There are pockets of the country which you need to do really well in, and the North East, I would have thought, is one of them, where the Conservatives didn't actually perform disastrously, even though in a lot of the rural areas they did. In some of the seats like Harlow, for example, which you would expect to take back if Labour are going to win power, I think the Conservatives gained a seat there. You look at Ipswich, where Labour did gain a seat, but Ipswich is one of those seats where you kind of need to make sure you win that. And I could go on. There were others over the course of the country, and yet the ones that Labour is celebrating, like Plymouth, which you would expect Labour to win back in a good year, essentially won back because the Conservatives were murdering trees.
Well, I think there's a lot more to it than that. And actually, the spread across...
Did I do well there, Nikki?
Yeah, don't bring up the trees again.
Okay. Right.
You know, I think that there's always local factors that have to be taken into consideration in any local area. And it's not quite as straightforward as whatever's happening nationally, that's how people are voting in local elections. There are often some quite hyper-local elements that are taking place, things that people really care about, that when it comes to a general election they might vote differently on. But I think actually we did see a really positive spread of Labour right across the country, from areas in the northwest, places like Erewash, places like Derbyshire, and like you said, places like Plymouth. I've got some family in sort of Kent, Gillingham, that kind of area, where Labour were making gains in places that we didn't even hold in 1997. I think that we've seen a really positive growth in Labour's performance. I think it was something like 9% overall, which, you know, as a swing in a local election is brilliant, considering that I think the previous time that all of these seats were up for election was the second to worst Conservative performance ever, and they went 1,000 seats back on that. But clearly some of the places that some of the third parties were coming through, people aren't going to be voting for those parties at a national election, because they know that nationally you do have a choice between a Labour government or a Conservative government. And taking that into account, I think that these polls set us in place for a majority government at the next general.
Zach Polanski, the Greens, I think, made 249 gains. Almost exactly half the number that the Labour Party did. But let's first of all stick with Martin's question about Rishi Sunak's electoral popularity. Do you look at him and think, well, he's not a vote winner, but compared to Liz Truss, he is?
Well, Rishi Sunak clearly isn't a vote winner, and now we've got lots of ex-Conservative councillors who are testament to that. I think the Conservative government, though, are out of touch, they're out of ideas, and they're out of time. So this isn't just about Rishi Sunak. This is about a whole failed ideology that I don't think any Conservative MP at this point could rescue. But then you have to look at, why have Labour not done better? So if we look at relative gains, the Labour Party increased by 10%, but the Green Party increased by 46%. And I think that's because...
Partly because you were standing a lot more candidates.
Well, with more candidates than ever before. But I also think that the Labour Party, for a long time now, we saw Keir Starmer stand on a particular platform. He has abandoned almost every pledge that he stood on when he was leader. I think he's lacking vision, leadership, and any practical solutions. And I think what the Green Party have done in this election is we've been within communities, and our candidates often aren't professional politicians. They're teachers, nurses, people who are embedded in their communities. As I've been going around the country and I've seen those people...
You sound just like a Liberal Democrat, which is funny because you used to be one, didn't you?
Well, for about 2 minutes. I also think that it's really important that community politics does come through to mainstream politics. And I don't think it's good enough to have a Conservative government or a Conservative leader or a Labour leader who just seems to be happy to be a little less awful than the Conservative leader. I think we all deserve better than that. So if you take something like migration, for instance, we've got Keir Starmer criticising the Conservatives, but he's criticising them because stopping the boats is inefficient as opposed to inhumane. It's going to cost £9 billion over 3 years. That's a very expensive way to be cruel. And it's just unbelievable that a Labour leader can't come out and give a positive, inclusive vision of migration. So I think all in all, the Green Party have got a unique space now to offer hope to people, and that's something this country desperately needs.
But you've also taken a leaf out of the Liberal Democrat playbook in that you are different people to different communities, aren't you? Because you won some seats, and I think there's certainly one in South Tyneside where you won it because you said we're against all housing developments, and yet you will come onto this programme and tell me how much Britain needs more houses for young people to live in.
I don't think that is true. So we had a housing charter that ran through the whole country, which was about having the right homes in the right place at the right price. But I think the point is more than that. I think if you look at green values, if we're talking about clean air, if we're talking about green space, those are values that everyone cares about. That's not a political ideology. That's about making sure that the Green Party is representing what people actually want, rather than what a whip says, or rather than what a big party machine says. And again, I think that's something unique that the Green Party have. And when people see elected Green councillors, they want more elected Green councillors. Our next job is to get Green MPs. So if you look at somewhere like Bristol West, where Carla Denyer is standing, there's 20 councillors there, 17 of them are now Green. So if you can see, if people vote nationally the same way they did locally. Carla Denyer will be the next MP in Bristol West. I accept getting people to vote nationally the same way locally is a challenge, but it's a challenge we're ready to take on.
Just before I come to Nikki, some breaking news. A jury in New York has found that former US President Donald Trump did not rape his accuser, E. Jean Carroll. However, it has found that he did sexually abuse her in the 1990s. Now, this is a civil trial, so there's no prospect of him going to prison. E. Jean Carroll has been awarded $2 million in damages. Well, you'll hear a bit more about that, I'm sure, later. Nikki Aiken, there is no denying that Rishi Sunak didn't deliver in terms of winning votes on Thursday, did he?
Look, we said at the very start that we expected to lose 1,000 councillors, and we did. And I think people thought that we were spinning it. We weren't. We knew that was in the offing, and sadly it was. But what I found, and I said this to you on election night, Ian, that when I was on the doorsteps in places like Medway, places like Hertfordshire, Surrey, many of our voters who'd voted for us previously in locals and generals said that they weren't voting for us this time. They weren't voting for anybody else. I think a lot of our votes stayed away. I saw that in Westminster last year when we
Not
lost.
in Medway, it didn't?
No, not in Medway. Well, let's look at let's wait and see what the numbers actually say.
Well, we know what the numbers said.
When we've done our analysis with our votes, because I do think that obviously some people switched, but more of our voters stayed at home because they wanted to send a very clear message that they were not happy with what happened over the last couple of years with Partygate and then obviously with the Liz Truss premiership. But what people were saying to me on the doorstep was that they like Rishi. They accept that he is making a difference, that he is, wanting to resolve the issues we've got, halving inflation, reducing the debt, growing the economy, cutting the waiting lists, and stopping the boats. That is what he's prioritising.
None of those things are happening.
But that's what he's prioritising. It takes a while. We can't do it overnight. A lot of these issues. And
well, you've had 13 years to do at least some of those things.
These are his priorities now, following the COVID pandemic, following the ongoing crisis or the war.
But as Henry says, they're not resonating with the electorate. There is no grand vision. Everybody knew what Margaret Thatcher wanted to see. Everybody knew what Tony Blair wanted to see. I think a lot of people knew what David Cameron wanted to see. But as Henry says, I mean, he can't articulate a vision that Rishi Sunak has. I certainly can't. Can you?
But I think that will come out during a general election campaign. We're not in a general election campaign. We're nowhere near.
Well, we are about to be in one. I mean, it's 15 months away.
15 months away, and that's why the Prime Minister has said very clearly, he said it in January, he's been saying it throughout the rest of the year, that he has got his 5 priorities. That's what he is focusing on. As we get nearer to a general election, this time next year, I would expect there to be a lot more of a vision for the future.
But you're sounding like
the issues we're facing
Labour
now.
spokespeople, when they come on the programme, they say, well, you don't expect me to write a manifesto on your programme, do you? And I'm thinking, well, no, I don't. But I do want a bit of detail in advance.
But the Prime Minister has laid out the detail of his priorities now for this year, because before we can get into general election mode, we have got to sort out inflation. It is obviously a worldwide issue, but we have got to put our policies in place to make sure that we can halve it so people get more money back into their pockets so they can spend it, we can grow the economy. So I think, it is right that the Prime Minister has his 5 priorities. He is delivering on those now. That is what he's focused on. And as we get into a general election, of course, we all want to see the vision for the future from the Conservative Party.
OK, we will move on in just a moment. It's 8:15.
LBC Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
We have Henry Hill from Conservative Home, Zach Polanski, Deputy Leader of the Green Party. Have you been on the programme since you've become Deputy Leader?
Only on a one-on-one interview. It's my first time on Cross Question.
Well, congratulations on that. Charlotte Nichols is Labour MP for Warrington North, and Nikki Aiken, Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party and MP for the cities of London and Westminster. Just a follow-up email question from Anne on the local elections. Should the Conservative Party leadership be worried about the rise of fringe groups like the Conservative Democratic Organisation and National Conservatism, which are both holding conference meetings over the next week or so? I'd have thought any Conservative group that calls itself National Conservatism, I mean, they want their heads read, don't they?
I've never heard of them, to be honest, so this is the first time I've ever heard of them.
Well, I think Michael Gove and Swella Braverman are speaking.
They are speaking at this conference. I mean, I have to say, if I got an invitation, which I haven't had an invitation to speak at this conference, but if I had, I just think the name would be enough to put me off. How serious? I mean, what kind of organisations are these, Henry?
Okay. So, Conservative Democratic Organisation is essentially Boris Johnson's Japanese infantry who haven't surrendered yet. Their putative goal is to change and make the Conservative Party more democratic and make sure the members' votes are respected. But there is actually already a group that does that. It's called the Campaign for Conservative Party Democracy, or Campaign for Conservative Democracy. It's very old. It's got some very good ideas. This is just a group that likes Boris Johnson.
Funded by Lord Cruddas.
Yeah, essentially. And then National Conservatives, I don't know what sort of organisation they are. It's basically an American import, because National Conservatism is big in the States, and sadly we share a common language, and so these ideas do tend to come across eventually. I couldn't tell you what National Conservatives believe. I don't think there's a coherent ideological programme under there. It's just a conference and a label and a collection of politicians. I don't think it's at all significant.
As long as its slogan isn't Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer, I suppose we shouldn't be too worried.
Well, I mean, I think that we can set the bar a bit higher than that, hopefully, in 21st century Britain, but no, there's nothing there. There's absolutely...
I mean, Charlotte, all political parties have these fringe groups. You had or have Momentum. I suppose you could sort of liken it to one of those. What do you make of these?
I mean, I don't know anything about these two groups in particular, but I have noticed in recent years the Conservative Party, both at a local level in Warrington, but also nationally, having some rather odd bedfellows, including Turning Point and others. So I would view it with a degree of dubious scepticism, I
also
think.
American, Turning Point.
Zach?
I think more voices in a political system is a positive thing, even if I don't agree with them, and I'd like to see proportional representation, so all voices can be represented.
Because you're so Lib Dem, aren't you?
You're just going to call me that for an hour.
I am, I think.
The Greens were talking about proportional representation long
I'm
before,
only going to call you if you live up to the reputation. But right, let's go to another question. It's from Chris in Stubbington. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Ian. Should new protest laws in the Public Order Act be repealed again after Saturday's arrests before the coronation?
Now, the Metropolitan Police arrested quite a few people, I think 46, and then they've released them all without charge. I think they were charged, now they've dropped all of the charges, and including, I think, 6 protesters from the anti-monarchy group Republic, on the basis that they had so-called lock-on devices, which I have to say there was a new expression to me. Anybody care to explain what a lock-on device is?
Yeah, it's where you lock yourself onto a barrier or a fence.
Right, so I suppose that there could have been some justification for that. But today, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, has denied that protest is banned by the new laws, or that the police did anything wrong in making these arrests. Labour said it would rectify issues with the new law, but didn't commit to repealing it altogether. Zach Polanski.
So first of all, there's severe problems with the Metropolitan Police. We are being over-policed and under-protected, particularly communities of colour. But on top of that, this is amplified by a government who have created this bill that Green peers and our Green MP opposed at every single stage. Because ultimately, if you create vague laws that talk about arresting people for a disturbance, then you need to know what a disturbance is. And we've seen lots of videos on the ground where people were asking police officers, can I shout? Can I hold a placard that says "Not My King"? Now, the argument to this is that we didn't want to be a national or a global embarrassment on the stage. I think there's nothing more embarrassing than looking worse or as bad as China or Russia in terms of people not even being able to hold a slogan on a piece of card. I think this is incredibly serious. I'm very worried about it. In London, for the first time, the Greens actually are chairing the Police and Crime Scrutiny Committee. So Caroline Russell, my Green colleague, will be asking Mark Rowley some serious questions of Metropolitan Police. Ultimately, though, I think the government has some serious questions to ask or to answer about these laws. And again, with the Labour Party, we heard Keir Starmer say today, or David Lammy, that they wouldn't repeal this if there was a Labour government. What is the point of a Labour government if they're not going to repeal Conservative policies? And we've just talked about when parties say, oh, I'm not going to write the manifesto yet. This was the opposite excuse. David Lammy said, oh, when we're in government, we won't have time for that. I mean, it's an unbelievable answer that we have some of the most authoritarian, bordering on fascist policing laws, and Keir Starmer, as a Labour Prime Minister, would not repeal those. That's dire and needs to be called out.
Nikki Aiken, did the police go over the top?
I think we've got to look at the context. It was the largest event of its kind for a generation. There were tens and tens of thousands of people in central London wanting to enjoy the coronation. There were hundreds of heads of state and kings and queens from other nations. So it was a huge security operation, and anything could have gone wrong, but it didn't. And I'm quite relieved, Iain, that we're not here talking about anything serious that could have happened. I saw the one of the police horses who got spooked and fell into the spectators, and I think seriously hurt one of the police officers on duty. And if demonstrators had megaphones, there were suggestions of rape alarms, that could have seriously spooked horses, and that could have led to some serious injuries. And I think but can I just say, though, there were at least 150 to 200 people protesting in Trafalgar Square. This was not about stopping protesting. It was about protecting the freedom of people's right to enjoy the ceremony.
But there was one guy I saw, and this was on a video, so I'm relatively sure that it did happen. A guy wearing a Just Stop Oil T-shirt, but he had a coat sort of which obscured a bit of the text, and he was arrested for wearing a Just Stop Oil T-shirt. Now, to my mind, I mean, I frankly, a lot of the Just Stop Oil protesters I'd love to bang out for life, given the disruption that they've caused. But this guy clearly wasn't intending to sort of disrupt the coronation. He just happened to be wearing a Just Stop Oil T-shirt, just like you or I might wear a T-shirt out and about. When Mark Rowley effectively justifies the arrest of all of these people by saying, yes, but the spectators clapped us while we were doing it. I'm thinking, that is not interpreting the law. You're there to interpret the law. You're not there to receive the applause of other people. Well, exactly.
But I think it's a balance, isn't it? It's a balance about protecting the right to freedom.
Do you think they got the balance right?
Look, I think it was unfortunate that the 6 people who got arrested and the police have accepted that that might have been a mistake. I think that's really unfortunate for those people who spent 16 hours in custody, and I wouldn't wish that on anybody. But again, it's about the balance of the rest of the tens of thousands of people who were enjoying the event, and there was intelligence apparently about some minority of people wanting to disrupt the coronation and the processions seriously, and maybe causing some serious damage either through vandalism or through spooking some horses. And I think it is a balance. And look, whatever people think of the Public Order Act, we have to ensure that the police have got the reasonable powers. But again, going back to the point that this was a massive policing organisation, and if anything had gone wrong, if somebody had been able to spook a horse with a megaphone or a rape alarm or throw paint at a horse, we could be talking about.
There was also a journalist that was arrested. Now, after our own Charlotte Lynch was arrested on one of these protests, just because she was doing her job and covering it, and I think there was. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there was a clause put into this new legislation to prevent this happening, and yet it still happened again on Saturday. That you can't defend that, can you?
No, I'm not saying this was perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I think we have to keep it in context.
Okay.
That it was a massive policing operation, and it is a balance.
Rich Felgate was the journalist who was arrested on Saturday. He had also been arrested back in November with Charlotte Lynch as a serial arrestee. Charlotte Lynch, let's go to the question that Chris is asking. Should the new protest laws in the Public Order Act be repealed after Saturday's arrest before the coronation?
So I think that I agree with what Nikki said insofar as, obviously the size and scale of this as a policing operation. But part of the reason that we saw the issues that we did was because of how badly defined the act is. So a lot of it talks about not only creating a disturbance, but actually, a conspiracy to create a disturbance, or that you've got suspicion that someone might create a disturbance. So you don't know what a disturbance is for starters, but then how do you know what someone's doing to say that...
So you'd be in favour of repealing the Act?
So I think that rather than just a blanket repeal of it, I would like to see it replaced with something better, because I think that there will be elements within it that potentially take us forward in certain places.
You voted against it, but this is where I don't see the logic. If you vote against something, you didn't want it to be passed in the first place, so why not just say, when you come into power, well, we'll repeal it, because it's a bad thing?
Well, I feel like replacing it is better than repealing it, because there will always be parts of any bill, even some of the worst ones, that are worthwhile. If you're replacing it, you're taking the bits that do work and taking out the bits that don't. In the public order bill in general, I think that there are aspects of it, particularly in terms of what the police can do for preventative actions and things like that, that may be helpful in certain circumstances.
That's what conspiracy is.
Pardon?
But that's what conspiracy is. Conspiracy is preventative policing. That's what that
Certainly,
empowers.
but it should be more focused on having those discussions in the lead up as opposed to arresting people. So one of the things that I found utterly bizarre in this was the fact that Republic had actually been engaging with these police liaison officers throughout the process to make sure that what they were doing was going to be lawful, that the police were going to be okay with it, to make sure that their rights to protest could be respected, and yet somehow still not only found themselves arrested but in custody for 16 hours on really flimsy, spurious pretexts.
I'm not sure it was totally spurious. If they had lock-on devices, I mean, what were they going to be used for apart from what Zach has just been saying?
But again, lock-on devices is very badly defined within the legislation, because there were people arrested at the weekend for having string and having luggage tags. Now, I don't think that either of those things are things which you can't legitimately carry around, in the same way as it would be perfectly legitimate to be carrying around a bike lock if you've got a bike. Just because you have something that could be used for something else doesn't mean that's what it's going to be used for, and that if you're carrying one of those things, that should mean you being in custody for 16 hours. This is part of the problem with the bill. I think just the other point to mention is the fact that I think the public have broadly lost confidence in the Met Police in general, because the context of this is that it's coming off the back of the Baroness Casey review and all of the failings at a strategic level within the Met Police. This isn't a one-off incident of bad policing. This is a pattern of
I think the
problems
problem
with the Met
here
Police.
is, and we'll be talking about this after 9 o'clock, is that people are starting to lose confidence in the new Metropolitan Police Commissioner, because he's made himself look utterly ridiculous today. He denied that there was institutional racism in the Metropolitan Police, and there's one or two other incidents, and you think, well, does he actually get it, Henry?
I mean, I think the first thing, if you're talking about him looking ridiculous to the political, to us perhaps, but I mean, never underestimate the authoritarianism of the British people. In 2011, YouGov did some polling after the riots then, and they found that a third of respondents would back using live ammunition on rioters, and every single other option, including tear gas and horses and all the rest of it, had over 50%. So, there's who is his audience exactly? I think it's interesting that although we've talked about repealing the legislation, nearly everything that we've talked about has been an operational decision on the part of the Metropolitan Police, at least one of which, the arrest of a journalist, breached an explicit provision of the legislation. The police are operationally independent, and I think that we should distinguish between those two things. In this instance, they erred. They were always going to at some point. They're the Metropolitan Police. I think in this particular case, it was probably better to err on the side of caution, given that we haven't had a coronation since the 1950s. Normally in British law, if you have a term in law that is not clear, it is refined through case law. That's how it works in common law, but the government could refine the meaning of certain terms. But ultimately, no one wants to admit that they live in it's a fundamentally uninteresting situation, but forget all the talk about fascism in Russia and China and all the rest of it. The farthest you need to go to find a country with policing an order of magnitude more vigorous, shall we say, than Britain is France. Right? If you look at what happened when Emmanuel Macron wanted to go down the Parisian roads today or the other day without getting near the crowds, the police just cleared all those streets. So it's important to keep this in context. Fundamentally, what the successive public order acts are about is that The right to protest should be distinguished from the right to do whatever you want as long as that is justified by the motive of protest. That means that these bills are designed to stop people mounting coordinated attacks to jam public infrastructure, to harass individuals, to blockade businesses, blockading things like hospitals, which we've seen in the past. The police need those tools. They need to be better, and the Metropolitan Police do need reform, but those tools are necessary.
Zach, quickly.
I think the real question here is, Nikki was talking about, we've got to stop serious violence. Well, of course, but we already have powers to stop serious violence. So the real question is, what was the Public Order Act put there to do, other than not to embarrass the government because they don't like protests?
It was to answer new forms of protest we've seen with the likes of Extinction Rebellion.
Suffragettes have been doing it for decades.
We are going to move on in just a moment with our panel here. 0345 6060973 if you'd like to put a question to them. It's 8:32. News headlines on LBC with Andy Ivey.
A jury in a civil case in New York has found Donald Trump sexually abused a newspaper columnist, E. Jean Carroll, in 1996, but did not rape her. She's been awarded around $5 million in total in compensation. The Met Police Commissioner has described the arrest of 6 anti-monarchy campaigners at the weekend as unfortunate, but Sir Mark Rowley says he supports the officer's decision before the coronation on Saturday. The father of a 14-year-old boy murdered in a machete attack says he will never forgive the killer. 17-year-old Marcus Walker from Bromley in Kent has been given a life sentence with a minimum of 19 years for stabbing Jermaine Cools in Croydon in 2021. LBC weather, heavy showers and thunderstorms across southeast England, only slowly clearing tonight. Tomorrow, a mixture of sunny spells and showers across most parts, a high of 18 degrees.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
With us in the studio on Cross Question are Zach Polanski, Deputy Leader of the Green Party, the Tory Deputy Chairman Nikki Aiken, Charlotte Nichols, Labour MP for Warrington North, and Henry Hill, Deputy Editor of Conservative Home. Right, an Alexa question now from Nikki in Kent. Was it right for King Charles to have privately described the Rwandan scheme as appalling? Well, Boris Johnson's former communications chief at Number 10, Gito Harry, has said on his new Global Original podcast, Unprecedented, that Johnson, quotes, squared up to the King after he made that comment in private. I think it was at the Commonwealth Leaders Summit. Charlotte?
I mean, I would agree with him.
But should a king be saying that sort of thing?
Well, and this is the issue, isn't it, when we have a constitutional monarchy, that one of the things that people across the political spectrum always said about the Queen was that actually they didn't know what her views on politics were. Now, that's going to be very different with King Charles, given that it's been such a long time to get to the point that he is king, that a lot of us are very keenly aware of what his political views in a range of areas are. And, I think that given his role not only as king, but obviously Supreme Governor of the Church of England, that this is a moral question as much as it is a political one. And I don't disagree with his analysis, to be honest.
Because he does have a constitutional role to warn prime ministers, doesn't he? If the monarch thinks that they're going down the wrong course. I think maybe an allied question to this is whether Gita Hari has any business making these comments public.
Exactly.
Harry, even though it is on a global original podcast. Harry Hill.
No, he doesn't. Fundamentally, the advice between the monarch and the prime minister has been a part of our constitutional settlement for a long time. Successive prime ministers have said that the late Queen was an enormously useful source of advice and counsel. So the Queen did have views, but they weren't leaked because those were private. And the King, now that he's king, I'm sure will be more guarded with his public statements on politics, but he has every right to express private views to politicians about any subject that he likes, because he's fundamentally a human being and lives in this country with the rest of us. What you shouldn't be doing is leaking those comments to try and attract some publicity to your podcast, because fundamentally that does undermine the perceived neutrality of the monarch, which is important. So no, Charles can think whatever he likes about the Rwanda scheme. If he and Boris Johnson went at it over it, fine. That's not a challenge to the Constitution. Gita Hari leaking it for publicity, that is.
Nikki.
I quite agree with Henry. I think if you've heard from previous prime ministers, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, they've always said they found their audiences with the Queen very, very supportive and very helpful. The monarch was the only person that the prime minister could perhaps have those type of conversations with. So I think it's really disappointing that Gito has said what he has said. And I don't know how he found out. I guess Boris told him, which again,
Yes.
You shouldn't be telling anybody about your conversations with the monarch. So obviously it's disappointing, but I agree with Henry. The monarch can have his own views. He can discuss them with the Prime Minister, but nobody should hear about them outside that audience.
Well, I'm sure that Gita Hari would love to publicise his podcast, so we'll have him on as a guest on Cross Question soon. I'm sure Corey can arrange that maybe next week or the week after. Zach Polanski, are you going to break the consensus here?
Well, I think it is appalling, but actually what's much more appalling is sending refugees to Rwanda. I think we clearly need safe routes for refugees. We need better reunification for children.
That's
we
not
need
the
to end this
question.
ridiculous thing where
not the
refugees
question.
can't do a work visa.
It's not the
It's not the question, but they are the important group
Sound
to
like a
defend. They're some of the most vulnerable people to defend, and I think it's important to defend them.
But do you think King Charles should be saying this kind of thing to his Prime Minister?
Well, I think that's clearly between the relationship between the monarch and the Prime Minister, but as the Green Party would be looking at different constitutional arrangements anyway. And I think if the King is going to say anything, I would rather that he says something that is pro-refugee and also pro-environmental, but ultimately I'd like to see politics happen with democratic elected people.
Just before we go on to the next question, highlights and lowlights from the coronation weekend, Henry?
Oh, Lord. I think for mine, actually, slightly niche one perhaps, but compared to other countries, France and the United States and others, we don't actually fly our flag very much. It's not usually part of the public realm in the way it is in other countries. And actually, seeing London decked out in all those Union Jacks was really nice. It really livens things up. And I think that that's something we should probably keep from the coronation and take forward. If you look at your average French politician, they'll have 5 tricolours flying out of their window at City Hall or Town Hall. Don't think we need to go quite that far, but a bit more pageantry in our day-to-day lives rather than saving it for every 50 years.
Because we think it's weird when a minister has a Union Jack behind him in their office,
it's really strange how because we've put all of our sort of pomp and pageantry in the monarchy, and then royal events are relatively rare. It does sometimes leave the rest of the public realm feeling a little bit sterile, and I think we should take that on.
So 2 for me. I think all of the excellent sort of Twitter memes about Penny Mordaunt in her role.
We might have a little question on her a bit later.
They were pretty good. And I also think on Sunday I went to a coronation service at my local Church of England church, and much like the coronation service itself, which was very multi-faith, having the chief rabbi there on Shabbat was obviously a huge moment, different faith leaders from different faith communities. It was a very similar thing on a local level on the Sunday, and I just really enjoyed being part of that and seeing what it meant to people, not only on a kind of constitutional level, but also on a religious level for some of my local Anglican community.
Zach?
I have a fun bit's coming in a moment, but my low light was during a cost of living crisis. I thought the whole thing was a bit tin-eared. But my highlight, and I can't believe I'm admitting this nationally, is I'm a huge Lionel Richie fan. And I saw the clip on YouTube, and although he wasn't in his best peak, I still love a bit of Lionel Richie.
Take that were dreadful.
Oh, God. And you could only get 3 of them.
I know.
Pretty
That
grim.
was ridiculous.
I love Lionel Richie too.
Oh, there is
I saw
consensus.
him in Hyde Park with Stevie Wonder, and they were great. My highlight, I think, I just loved I loved the whole ceremony. I thought from start to finish, and I loved the inclusivity of it all. Having the choir there and the music was fascinating, and I just felt part of it, to be honest. And I was watching it at home.
Yeah, there was a bit of that, wasn't there? 'Cause I felt a little bit like that. The thing that grated with me was, I spent Sunday evening watching West Ham beat Manchester United, but then I did watch the concert back on fast forward, and I couldn't believe what I was watching some of it. Not only were there people I'd never heard of, and I'm thinking, well, it's the King's coronation, surely we should have heard of all of the different acts. But then they had the talking heads in the middle of it. Basically, it was like watching something in North Korea when they were saying, and of course King Charles is the most brilliant swordsman, or the most brilliant...
Why have a concert?
Cricketer, or the most brilliant scientist. And I was thinking, this is what Kim Jong-un likes.
And he can play 5 instruments.
Exactly.
That's what the power of privilege will do.
At the same time.
I thought they should have given him, both of them, the day off. I mean, they must be exhausted after Saturday. And then the 17th. The worst bit for me, though, Ian, was the rain. I went to street parties on Saturday afternoon, and it was pouring.
Luckily, I didn't have to do
the worst
that.
bit for me was the fact that when you're watching it, they did all the stuff about people coming in and the different outfits and all this sort of thing, but they didn't play enough, in my mind, of all the people that were in the procession outside, which I was only a bit annoyed by, because obviously staying right by Westminster when the days I'm in London, I'd heard them practising it all at like 3:30 in the morning for most of the last week, and I kind of thought, what was that for if you weren't even going to see a lot of it on telly?
Was Michelle O'Neill from Sinn Féin there? Because
no one mentioned her.
No one mentioned her at all. There was a big deal made of the fact that she was going to go, and I thought she'd be sat next to Prince Harry.
I thought she was there.
She was I didn't see her, but she was going.
I didn't see her, but
Katy Perry was there.
Anyway,
Katy Perry found her seat eventually.
Yeah.
Well, I kept thinking it was Katy Perry, which would have been a different kind of performance. But anyway, I suppose we better get back to the serious business of the day, but we'll leave that for just a couple of minutes. It's 8:44.
LBC.
In a
leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
Right, back to the serious stuff. Shema in Tottenham has sent in a text question. If you ask GPs what they need to improve their services, do you think they'd prefer investment in more and better paid doctors and nurses, or a new phone system? That comes on the announcement today that the government has spent £1.2 billion trying to reduce the backlog in GP appointments. New phone systems is one of the solutions that they've come up with. Getting pharmacists to write prescriptions apparently is another one. Nikki Aiken.
Well, I think it's a mix, isn't it? So there's 1,900 more GPs now than there was in 2019. There's 4,000 now training.
2015, though.
4,000 now being in training to be full-time GPs. I welcome the pharmacist announcement today. I think, personally, I would rather be able to pop into my pharmacy to get a prescription for an earache or, whatever it's going to be, without having to go down and wait for a GP appointment during the day. You have to take time off work. So making it more easy for people, more flexible, I think it's got to be a good thing. And obviously, telephone system investment, again, is a good thing. It's a mixture of everything. We've got to look at technology, look at flexible ways of for patients, whether it's GPs or pharmacists, and obviously employing and training more GPs.
Zach?
I think we need both. I think our NHS is chronically underfunded. Now, we're often told there's no money left, but actually we could implement things like a wealth tax, a 1% wealth tax on the wealthiest 1%, just for starters. That would raise about £75 billion a year. Those aren't my figures, that's for University of Greenwich. And that also assumes...
Oh, the University of Greenwich, we all have to obey what they think, don't we?
Well, I think it's important to get academic studies on these things. I think you could look at other taxes too, but I think the point is this. There's 133 vacancies in the NHS. It isn't just on its knees, it's on its face, as has been said.
133,000.
133,000, thanks for the correction. I think it's really, really important that we invest in it properly, and I think it's not good enough to pit workers against each other. Actually, we should be paying staff properly. The Institute for Fiscal Studies, maybe that's an organisation we will listen to, they said to give everyone a 7% pay rise would cost about £5 billion. I actually think it should be more than that as a pay rise, but I think we should have these important conversations about there is money round. We saw the money during the pandemic, we saw the money when we bailed out the banks, and actually, if we decide that the NHS is a political priority, then there's money for it, and it absolutely should be a political priority.
Henry?
So ultimately, they're two completely different orders of magnitude of solution, right? Trying to ease demand on GP services is a useful thing. If pharmacists can safely and responsibly do that job, then that's good. Obviously, you do want more doctors as well. It's always nice if you can just spend more money on it. I'm not entirely sure Zach and I will entirely agree on how much money is available. But you could also do other things. So currently, we have a strict cap on the number of doctors that we can train here because the government fully foots the cost of their training. And then those doctors are free to, and increasingly do, go and work in other countries, meaning that we don't actually benefit from the money the government has spent on that training. You could, for example, have the government say, trainee doctors will pay student loans in the normal way, and then the government will repay a chunk of that student loan for every year actually worked in the NHS after graduation, and then after 5 or 7 years the government has met the cost in full. That would ensure that the money that we do spend training doctors was actually invested in the NHS, and it wouldn't necessarily cost us any more money. So there are ways you can go about mitigating some of this that don't just involve either tinkering at the very edges or pumping endless amounts of money into an unreformed system where demand is only going to go up.
Charlotte?
I think what you have to consider is the fact that the NHS has been utterly broken by 13 years of Conservative government. The things that are wrong with it at the moment aren't things that can be fixed quickly. And there are elements where...
You're getting your excuses in first.
No, quite the opposite, in fact. It's one of those things that, when we look at the NHS, it's about social care. And of course, that's an area that has been not having the level of investment that it needs, that is massively fragmented, privatised, sort of outsourced model of really running wages down right to the very bottom there. You have pharmacists where in different parts of the country, and sometimes even within the same town, different pharmacists being able to deliver certain services or not, because it's all commissioned pharmacy by pharmacy, town by town, as opposed to nationally a decision taken about what pharmacists can and should be able to do. You have these GP backlogs, and again, as was said, one of the reasons that we're having issues is not just because of the cap on the number of people that can be trained in any given year, and Labour have said about opening up the number of medical school places, but it's actually about the fact that in countries like Australia, where they do value doctors more, they pay them significantly more. No one has to learn another language to move there because, of course, we share a language.
Up to a point.
Yeah, potentially. But, it's one of those things that here we're paying our junior doctors something like £14 an hour. Now, given the minimum wage at the moment...
For their first year.
It's not just their first year. That's what junior doctors get if they're an FY1, and you don't automatically go up to the next stage in your second year. So you have junior doctors on £14 an hour. Minimum wage is £10.43 at the moment, I believe. That is not a huge differential.
They're going to all earn $30,000 a year right from the start. So that's progress, surely.
It's progress, but when you consider the number of hours that they do, the number of years that they've had to take to study, all of the stresses and strains that come with the job, the level of responsibility they have, this is people that have literally got people's lives in their hands. I really don't think that they're properly rewarded for that, and that's why we're seeing people move to countries like Australia, where they have better working patterns, where they're paid better, and where they're treated better.
But they have a very different health system. But I think Charlotte raises a very good point about social care. And I think one of the things I'd like to see reformed is the amount of money that goes to local authorities rather than directly to the NHS. The NHS gets so much money for social care when it's the local authorities that are dealing with the issue on the front line. Obviously my opposition colleagues are not going to agree with me, but we are seeing record amounts of money being invested in the NHS,
however much you say that, the general public shake their hands and say, well, if you are spending all this money, it's being I can't say the word I want to say, but weeds down the drain.
And therefore, and I think we have to accept that the NHS, when it was established 70 odd years ago, we're in a different place today. People are living longer. People are living with conditions that they wouldn't have survived even 10, 20, 30 years ago. So, the pressures on the service are much greater than they were when it was established. And it was established as a health service, and it's really an illness service now. So I think we have to be very open to reform of it.
I want to squeeze in one more caller. Carlton is in Harrow. Hello, Carlton.
Oh, hello to you and all the panel. How are you all?
Hi.
All right? Yeah.
We're fine, thank you. What would you like to ask?
Well, I wanted to ask the final, do you think the verdict against Trump will make any difference to his re-election chances?
Just to recap, Donald Trump has been found to have sexually abused a woman called E. Jean Carroll in the 1990s. However, the jury in New York also found that he did not rape her, which she had also accused him of doing. The damages awarded have now gone up to almost $5 million. Charlotte Nicholas, in any other country, this would be career-ending for any politician. Do you think it will be for Donald Trump?
I really hope that it is, but it's one of the things that I think we see in countries all around the world, including our own, that unfortunately things like violence against women and girls is not taken seriously enough and is not considered career-ending. We have MPs in Parliament who have been found guilty of domestic violence who are still in post, for example. We can't act like we're, somehow above this and better. Unfortunately, globally, violence against women and girls is not taken seriously enough, whether in politics or anywhere else. And I really hope that this will be the end of his election chances. But I suppose, sometimes I know better than to hope on these things.
Henry?
I mean, I'm just endlessly pessimistic about Donald Trump. I think most people have made up their minds about him by now. And while I hope there are voters in America who are Republican voters who might have stuck with him, who this and other stories will change their mind, especially in the primary, because I think it would be better for America if the Republicans could field a credible candidate in the election. Ultimately, he won last time. He'd said some pretty horrible things last time. I hope he doesn't win, but I wouldn't stake my house or life on it.
Nikki?
I would like to see more women in politics, more candidates, more MPs, and it would be fantastic to have a female president of the United States. And I hope that's what we can do, because Charlotte's absolutely right about violence against women and girls. We don't take it as seriously. And I'm very proud of the track record of the government with the Domestic Abuse Bill Act now, and the Stalking Act and Modern Slavery Act. But there's still a lot more we've got to do within our society.
You haven't actually answered the question.
What was the question?
But will it be the end of Donald Trump's political career?
Sadly, I doubt it.
Zach?
I think Nikki and Charlotte are both right, particularly about more women in politics. I think it should have been over for Donald Trump when he mocked a disabled person, but he was still elected as president. I think he runs entirely off victim mentality, that the idea that the establishment are against him, and I worry that this will feed into that narrative. So if anything, it might have just helped him, which is pretty grim indeed. Can you take us to a more fun question, please?
I'm just about to do that, funnily enough. Robbie in Chelmsford has texted this. Penny Swardent, get it? Received high praise for her starring role at the coronation, carrying the Sword of Destiny. When have you unexpectedly received acclaim? When I say acclaim, that's with 2 C's rather than a claim. Henry.
Well, given that Conservative Home is independent of the government, I therefore get to say what I like about it, which often is unflattering. And so often when I've been on television, you'll have people writing in being like, why is he prepared to, talk about the government in that way? And the answer is because I'm not employed by them. And then also, I think my absolute favourite, I don't know if it's quite a claim, but it sometimes is just readers and viewers writing in about my appearance when they see me on television for the first time or hear me for the first time, because apparently there's some discordance between how I look and how I speak and how I write, and that's been described to me in very amusing ways on Twitter and by email over the years.
Give us an example.
Looks like a lad and sounds like a posho is the one that I think currently graces my Twitter handle. That was a viewer's wife's report.
Okay.
And occasionally you just get things like that, and it's sort of heartwarming.
See, this is why you should all be watching on Global Player. Charlotte Nichols.
I think it's one of those things in politics sometimes. What is quite nice is when you receive unexpected acclaim from people from different parties. So I had Tim Farron say something very nice on Twitter about...
is that the best you can do?
Well, it was unexpected. But I think actually, my favourite is I've now made James Cleverly cry twice with my speeches. Yeah, so...
How did you do that?
It was my Holocaust Memorial Day speeches. 2 of them, I've actually made the man cry. So, hopefully this year it'll be 3 for 3.
Wow. Nikki?
I think being given a shout out by Jess Phillips at an event recently about domestic abuse. And she actually, I was in the audience and she was on the panel, and she actually pointed me out and congratulated me on the work I've done on the Domestic Abuse Act, because I was the one who ensured that children now are considered victims, even if they're not directly involved in domestic abuse, if they're in a household with it.
I think the only Conservative to have pleased Just Phillips in the past, I have to be careful how I
It's sisterhood, you see.
It's Jacob Rees-Mogg. Zach?
My political answer is I'm the first gay Jewish deputy leader in British political history. My much more fun answer, though, is
that's something you've achieved. That isn't something you've been acclaimed
That's
for.
true. I was a backing singer on the X Factor Christmas #1.
No! Which one?
With Ben Haynow. I can't even remember what the name of the song was.
How did you get to do that?
I was in a gospel choir, London Community Gospel Choir.
I was also going to say, given that was unexpected acclaim, which one of those characteristics did you think would rule you out of a Green Party senior position?
And we'll leave that question hanging. Thank you all very much indeed to Nikki Aiken, Charlotte Nichols, Zach Polanski and Henry Hill. Cross Question returns, of course, tomorrow at 8 o'clock. Coming up in the next hour on LBC, we're going to return to one of the questions which we have dealt with over the last hour, and it's all about policing the coronation, because it seems to me that Sir Mark Rowley, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, has not covered himself in glory today. He's written an article justifying the police actions in the Evening Standard, in which he justifies the arrests of the Republic protesters by saying that the police officers were clapped for doing so. Spot the error in that judgment. How should we police protests in the future, particularly of this nature? Do you think the police got it wrong over the weekend? 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, a jury in New York has found Donald Trump sexually abused a writer